Stay off my bleachers, Toland. You clean beneath them, you do not inspect them. Then keep Section C empty until somebody qualified tells you this frame is safe. We open doors in 20 minutes, and I am not closing seats because a janitor heard a noise. That is not the same sound, and the difference is coming from the connection below your feet. You have a custodial radio, a mop, and a maintenance key. None of those make you an engineer. I never said they did, but I spent 18 years building grandstands and stadium seating systems. You expect me to believe you built stadiums before you started cleaning this school? Believe whatever you want after you keep those students off Section C for 10 minutes. Structures warn you before they fail if somebody listens.
At 5:49, the metal answered for me. A hard crack snapped beneath the third row. One connection jumped. A seating tier dropped several inches, throwing 3 students sideways. 14-year-old Milo Tressler landed badly, grabbed his ankle, and shouted as the entire West Bank shook once and settled at an angle that had not existed 5 seconds earlier. Adam froze. Graham dropped the mop and moved toward the aisle. Nobody stands together. Clear the lower rows first and keep everyone else seated until I call them. This is my team and my gym, Adam said, still fighting to recover command. Then help me keep your gym from loading the next frame all at once. By 5:52, the West Bank was moving under controlled evacuation instead of panic. Milo was carried to the floor by 2 staff members, pale and embarrassed by how much his ankle hurt. Graham did not touch the damaged connection again. He stood far enough back to see the bank as a system, watching the slight lean in one support post and the uneven line beneath the third seating tier. The first crack had frightened everyone because they could see what it had done. Graham was more worried about what it meant. A damaged connection did not always mark the place where the problem began. In a repeated steel frame system, stiffness could disappear in one bay and push load into another. The visible failure could be the structure's way of pointing somewhere else. At 5:58, Adam came down after the last student left West Section C. His earlier certainty had drained away, but anger still gave him something to hold. Tell me exactly what you think just happened, and do not give me another slogan. Graham looked at the dropped tier, then at the frame beside it. I think one connection stopped carrying load the way it was supposed to. The frame next to it picked up more than its share. You said you built these things. Were you an engineer or a contractor? Field superintendent. Seating systems, grandstands, arena renovations, stadium erection. Engineers designed. I made sure crews built what the drawings required. How many stadiums? Graham did not answer the question in the form Adam wanted. Enough to know you do not refill that bank until a structural engineer signs off. Adam looked at the mop lying on the floor. The contrast had become uncomfortable now that Graham's warning had come true. The fieldhouse director called district facilities, and within minutes the school stopped admitting spectators through the main lobby. People already inside were directed toward the court level while staff held the exterior doors. The playoff game was not officially canceled yet, but nobody pretending it would start on time believed himself anymore. At 6:04, Laura Baines arrived carrying a hard case, a flashlight, a measuring scale, and the authority everyone had been waiting to assign to the right job title. She was the district structural engineer on retainer, and she introduced herself to Graham without dismissing him or trusting him. Show me what you touched and what you heard before the movement. That sentence mattered. She did not ask what he thought first. She asked what he observed. Graham showed her the 2 braces he had tapped, the connection beneath Section C, and the slight witness mark where a plate had shifted against paint. Laura crouched near the damaged frame while Gerald Pritchard, the district facilities director, arrived behind her with a folder of inspection records. Gerald was 57, careful with liability, and visibly irritated that a gym full of playoff spectators had become a structural investigation less than an hour before tip-off. Annual inspection was completed in May, he said. No deficiencies requiring closure. Laura did not look up. Annual inspection tells me what was visible in May. It does not tell me what moved 5 minutes ago. Gerald opened the folder anyway. The bleachers also passed operation checks when they were opened last month. Graham pointed towards the adjacent frame. Look at the paint edge near that splice. Laura moved her light. A thin crescent of bare steel showed where two surfaces had rubbed. That is movement, she said. Repeated movement, Graham answered. The crack may be where the load ended up, not where the stiffness first disappeared. Gerald looked between them. Can you prove that? Laura finally stood. Not yet. That is why nobody is sitting here. She asked a maintenance worker to bring a portable jack so they could support a loose deck edge while examining the frame. The worker rolled the jack toward the first convenient point beneath the seating plank. Graham stopped him with one hand. Not under the decking. Put it under the frame line after Laura gives you the location. The worker hesitated, then looked to Laura. She nodded. He is right. Do not create a local support under something not designed to take it. It was the first moment Laura gave Graham visible credit, and he accepted it without expression. She took measurements at the damaged connection and at the neighboring frame. The geometry was subtle, but the pattern bothered her. One plate showed fresh slip. A nearby brace had a faint line of fretting at an edge that should have remained tight. At 6:11, Laura had enough measurements to reject the idea of one isolated random crack. The load path had changed. At 6:18, Gerald found the renovation drawings from 8 years earlier. Oakmere had widened an aisle, added accessible seating, and modified portions of both telescopic banks to create clearance. The drawings showed adapter plates and slotted splice connections at selected frames. Graham leaned over the sheet. These were field tolerance details. They let the crew adjust alignment without rebuilding the whole frame. Gerald glanced at him. You recognize the type? I recognize the idea. Lots of seating contractors used versions of it. Laura traced the West Bank detail with one finger. The damaged connection is inside the retrofit zone. Gerald immediately seized on the obvious explanation. Then somebody installed the retrofit wrong. Graham shook his head. Maybe, but do not decide that before we see the hardware. At 6:24, Laura looked across the court at the East Bank. It was still occupied. The pep band sat in the upper rows because staff had kept them in place while clearing the damaged side. Student section leaders were trying to stay quiet. Teachers stood at the aisles, telling everyone the delay was precautionary. Graham saw the percussion section before he saw Tessa. Then he found his daughter 3 rows from the top, one hand resting on the rim of a snare drum case. He did not call her name. Gerald followed his eyes. Your daughter is over there? Yes. Then get her down. Graham kept looking at the drawing. Not before we know how that bank wants to unload. Adam stared at him as if he had misheard. That is your daughter. And every other kid sitting beside her belongs to somebody too. Laura's attention sharpened. She had already seen Graham understand a frame line. Now she saw him refuse the most human temptation in the room. Graham pointed to the East Bank detail. Same adapter family, different locations, same retrofit package. Laura looked across the court again. If the problem belongs to the connection detail, the East Bank cannot be treated as independent just because it has not moved yet. At 6:28, public entry stopped completely. The gym grew quieter as the decision spread through staff radios. The West Bank was empty, the East Bank was not, and the first real question of the night had changed. They were no longer asking why one bleacher connection had cracked. They were asking whether the other side had been waiting to do the same thing. At 6:33, Graham found an archived drawing for the auxiliary gym across the north corridor. The smaller room had retractable bleachers too, but the set he was holding showed an older configuration without the adapter detail now under suspicion. Use the auxiliary gym as the staging area, he told Gerald. Keep students off the seating and move them to the court level. Laura studied the sheet. This drawing predates the retrofit package. That is why I want it. Different system, different risk. Gerald looked at the title block. This is marked existing conditions. Graham nodded. Existing before the main field house work. The auxiliary bank was not part of that project. The answer sounded clean enough to move on. That should have bothered Graham more than it did. Staff began redirecting approximately 80 students already on court level toward the north corridor so they could be held away from the field house. Graham went to the sealed access panel beneath the West Bank because he wanted one more look at the slotted connection before the fire department arrived. His custodial master key opened the lock, but a district inspection seal crossed the panel edge, documenting that the understructure access was not to be opened while the seating was deployed, except by authorized maintenance personnel. Gerald caught up just as Graham broke the seal. "You do not have authority to open that panel during occupancy. I need to see whether the slot has walked to the end of travel. Laura can request access. You cannot make that call because you recognize the hardware." Graham knew Gerald was right about authority. He opened the panel anyway. Inside, the connection told a more complicated story than the exterior witness mark. The plate had moved, but the bolt position was not at the end of the slot. A narrow fatigue crack ran from the edge of a weld where repeated micro-movement could have concentrated stress. Laura came over, annoyed at the broken seal, but interested in the evidence. "Do not touch anything else," she said. "Photograph only." Graham stepped back. Gerald wrote the seal violation down. It was not spite. It was a record he would have to explain later. Then Tessa appeared at the corridor door under supervision of a band director. The East Bank students were still seated, but the band director had pulled a few percussion instruments to the floor after staff began reorganizing the room. Tessa had heard enough radio traffic to know her father was involved. At 6:38, she looked at the old drawing in Graham's hand. "Dad, that is not what the auxiliary bleachers look like now." Graham turned. "What do you mean?" "They changed them the summer before freshman orientation. The front section used to be straight. Now, there is a wheelchair cutout near the north wall." Graham looked back at the drawing. The sheet showed no cutout. Gerald stopped writing. "2 summers ago?" Tessa nodded. "They had the gym closed for weeks. I remember because volleyball camp moved to the middle school." Graham's first instinct was resistance. "That may have been rails and seating boards, not the understructure." Tessa frowned. "You told me once that changing the shape on top usually means something underneath had to change too." The words landed harder because they were his. At 6:41, Gerald opened the district project archive on his tablet. He searched the auxiliary gym and found a later change order package Graham had not known existed. Laura read the scope over his shoulder. "Recoverable accessible notch-out, modified front frames, adapter hardware at 2 interior positions." Graham took the tablet. The detail number was not identical, but the hardware family was close enough to end the argument. "Stop the move," he said immediately. Gerald looked at him. "You were certain 3 minutes ago." Graham did not defend himself. "I was using an obsolete drawing. Stop the move." Staff in the north corridor reversed the students before they entered the auxiliary gym. No one was injured, but the change created confusion exactly when the building needed calm. Teachers had to hold students in classrooms and the cafeteria instead. Parents outside received conflicting messages about where students were being staged. At 6:43, Graham stood beside the broken access seal and watched the consequences of his own confidence ripple through the building. The mistake was not that he lacked experience. The mistake was that experience had made an old drawing feel familiar enough to trust. Laura closed the auxiliary package. "Structures warn you before they fail, if somebody listens," she said quietly. Graham looked at her. "That applies to information too. You had a warning the drawing was old. You moved past it because the answer fit what you wanted." He nodded once. "You are right." Gerald had heard enough. At 6:46, he told Graham to leave the technical command area. "You broke a district seal, recommended a staging location from outdated documents, and gave an operational direction outside your authority. I cannot keep you inside the decision loop because you have useful experience." Adam, who had spent the first hour wanting Graham gone, looked uncomfortable now. He also heard the first failure before anyone else. Gerald did not change his tone. "That does not erase the second decision." Graham saved him the argument. "He is right. Laura has the engineering authority. I do not." He picked up the mop he had abandoned near the West Bank and carried it into the north corridor, where the fieldhouse noise softened behind closed doors. For the first time that evening, there was nothing useful for him to calculate, inspect, or direct. Tessa found him near a trophy case at 6:50. The band director had been told to keep her off the East Bank until staff decided whether students would return to seats, but the building was in a holding pattern, and nobody was pretending the game still mattered. She leaned against the wall beside him. Are they sending you home? No, Gerald told me to stay out of the command area. That is different. You were wrong about the auxiliary gym. I was. Tessa looked through the glass at old team photographs. People keep saying you used to build stadiums, like that explains everything. Graham waited. Some of the kids think you got fired from something huge and ended up here. Kids are efficient storytellers. You never tell anyone what happened. Graham had answered versions of that question by changing the subject for 4 years. Tonight, hiding behind privacy suddenly felt too close to hiding behind a job title. I did not get fired. Tessa looked at him. Then why did you leave? Graham set the mop against the wall. When your mother was sick, I was in 4 states in 5 weeks. I kept flying home for appointments and leaving again because every project had a reason I was supposed to be there. Tessa's expression changed at the mention of Anna. I remember the airports. I remember missing things I told myself I would make up later. A concert, a parent meeting, one of her oncology visits because a crane inspection ran late in another state. Mom never blamed you. I know, that was not the problem. He looked towards the closed field house doors. After she died, I realized I had spent years building places for 50,000 people and could not explain why I was never in the same place as the 2 people who mattered most. Tessa swallowed. So you became a janitor because of me? Graham shook his head. I chose a local job because of us. There is a difference. She looked down at the mop. Did you hate it? Sometimes I hated what people assumed about me. I never hated being home when you woke up. The answer hit with more force than Graham intended. Tessa looked away quickly, blinked, then laughed once at herself, because tears had arrived in the middle of a structural emergency. You could have told me that before tonight. I should have. She wiped beneath one eye. Experience matters most when it can still be corrected, right? Graham smiled faintly. That sounds irritatingly familiar. You say irritating things when you are trying to teach me. At 6:52, the corridor radio came alive before he could answer. Laura's voice was controlled, but faster than before. Gerald, I need the East Bank held exactly where it is. Nobody stands until I say otherwise. Graham and Tessa both turned toward the doors. Gerald answered from inside. What did you find? Fresh witness movement on one adapter plate. I am checking the next bay now. Graham's face changed. Tessa saw it. That is my side. He picked up the radio, then stopped himself because Gerald had removed him from command, and Laura had not asked for him. A metallic ping sounded through the wall. Not loud, not dramatic. Graham knew it anyway. At 6:56, the East Bank had given its first audible warning. Laura's voice followed immediately. At 6:58, she locked the East Bank in place with one instruction. Freeze all movement. Do not let the student section stand. The gym became a different kind of dangerous in that instant. Panic usually demanded motion. The safest instruction now demanded stillness. Teachers moved along court level, telling students to remain seated. The pep band stopped talking. Adam stood near the bottom aisle and looked up at the rows of teenagers who had no idea why adults were suddenly asking them not to leave. Tessa stared at Graham. What happens if everybody gets up? We do not know enough yet. That is why they stay seated. And what happens if they stay there too long? Graham did not lie. That is what Laura has to decide. At 7:03, County Fire Rescue arrived with stabilization equipment, medical staff, and an incident commander who immediately separated life safety decisions from school authority. Gerald briefed the commander. Laura explained the suspected failure mechanism. Graham remained in the corridor. By 7:08, Laura had determined that any evacuation had to occur in controlled row groups rather than one mass movement, and then she came out to find Graham. I need you back. Gerald followed her through the doorway. No, we just removed him for exceeding authority. Laura faced him. He does not get engineering authority. I keep that. The incident commander keeps rescue authority. Then why bring him back? Because I need someone who understands how crews physically move under this type of deployed seating without improvising around the frame system. He knows the access geometry, and he has already stopped one bad support placement. Gerald glanced at Graham. He was also wrong 10 minutes ago. Laura nodded, and he corrected himself before anyone had to force him. I need that more than I need another person pretending certainty. Graham looked at Gerald. If I cross authority again, remove me again. Gerald exhaled. You stay under Laura and the incident commander. No independent orders. Agreed. The terms were clear enough to let everyone work. At 7:12, Graham returned to the field house, not as the secret expert who had finally taken over, but as one member of a command structure that had learned why titles and experience both needed limits. Laura showed him the East Bank photographs. The plate near one retrofit frame had moved enough to expose a bright edge beneath old paint. Another connection showed no visible crack, but carried a faint diagonal witness line that suggested the frame had shifted under load. Graham crouched at court level and sighted along the understructure. If you shore the lower bay here, the crew cannot reach the next frame from the center aisle. They need the service side. The fire rescue commander asked whether the service side remained clear. Graham nodded. There is a maintenance path behind the rear riser, narrow but continuous to the third interior frame. Laura pointed to the drawing. We stabilize the two lower affected bays first. Then we begin controlled evacuation in row groups. Adam looked at the students above them. Why not clear everyone now while the structure is still standing? Laura answered before Graham could. Because hundreds of people standing and moving together create a different load condition than seated occupancy. I want movement controlled and distributed. Adam looked at Graham. You agree? Yes. Fast is not the same as safe if everyone moves at once. At 7:16, the first rated stabilization strut went into position beneath Laura's designated frame line. Graham guided the rescue crew through the maintenance path, identifying obstructions from memory of the understructure layout, but he did not choose the support locations. Laura did. A firefighter called dimensions. Laura confirmed. The incident commander authorized placement. Graham's value came from knowing how the structure behaved in real space, not from replacing the people legally responsible for engineering and rescue. At 7:19, a nearby connection changed shape while they watched. The movement was small enough that most people on the court would have missed it. Graham saw the plate rotate a fraction against its witness mark. Laura saw his face. How much? Enough that I would not wait for a second look. She checked the scale against the photograph and made the call. At 7:22, the controlled evacuation began. Begin evacuation. Lower rows first, groups of 12. Alternate the aisles. Keep upper rows seated. Adam picked up the handheld microphone. For the first time all night, the loudest voice in the gym belonged exactly where it needed to be. Listen carefully, Adam told the students. Nobody stands until your row is called, and nobody runs when it is. A teacher near the lower aisle repeated the instruction. Adam looked up at the rows he had spent years treating as an extension of his program, his gym, his authority. Now every section had become a sequence he did not control by instinct. He looked toward Graham. Which side first? Graham pointed to Laura. She decides the structural sequence. You make the people follow it. Laura called the first rows. 12 students stood, moved toward the south aisle, and descended at normal walking speed. The bank gave no visible response. The next 12 followed from the opposite side. Below them, rescue crews continued placing stabilization, while Graham guided access from one frame line to the next. The process looked almost too calm to match the stakes. There were no flames, no smoke, and no falling concrete. There were teenagers carrying instrument cases, teachers counting heads, firefighters tightening rated struts, and one engineer watching tiny marks on steel as if a few millimeters could change the whole room. That was exactly what made the scene frightening. A structure close to failure did not owe anyone a dramatic countdown. At 7:26, Milo Tressler was being examined near the lobby when his mother arrived. He had a badly sprained ankle, not a fracture, and was more worried about whether the team would still play than about himself. His mother looked through the open lobby doors toward the field house and asked a staff member whether everyone was safe. The staff member could only answer truthfully. They are getting them out now. Inside, each cleared row reduced occupancy, but changed how the remaining weight sat on the structure. Laura watched the response after every group. Hold, she said, after the fifth movement. Adam raised one hand, and the next row stayed seated. Laura checked the lower connection. Graham crouched nearby, careful not to cross the taped line. "The frame is settling toward the shore," he said. Laura measured again. "That is what we want if it remains controlled." The rescue commander asked how long before the next group could move. Laura gave them 30 seconds. The students waited. Graham looked towards the top rows. Tessa was still there. She sat behind a bass drum now because the percussion section had been told to leave instruments in place. One younger freshman beside her kept bouncing his knee until Tessa put a hand on it and made him stop. Graham could not hear what she said, but he recognized the shape of the gesture. Stay still. She was helping enforce the same rule, keeping her trapped there longer. Adam followed Graham's eyes. "I can move her section next." Graham shook his head. "Not unless Laura calls it next." "Nobody would blame you." "I would." Adam looked back up at Tessa, then at the lower rows. "I owe you an apology for earlier." Graham kept his attention on the structure. "You owe me good crowd control. We can discuss the rest when everybody is on the floor." Adam nodded. It was not forgiveness. It was triage. At 7:34, roughly 2/3 of the east bank had been cleared. The lower and middle sections were empty enough that the remaining students looked isolated high above the court. Parents outside had begun receiving district alerts telling them to remain away from the building until reunification instructions were issued. Laura had just authorized the next 2 row groups when a firefighter beneath the north stair landing called over radio. "Movement at the landing frame. I have fresh slip at the plate." Laura went still. "Confirm location." The firefighter repeated the frame number. Graham knew it before Laura looked at the plan. That frame sat directly below one of the 2 egress routes they had been alternating. Laura raised her radio. "North route closed immediately. Nobody uses that stair until I reopen it." Adam looked up. Nearly 40 students remained above the level where the closed stair would have divided traffic. "We cannot funnel everyone south at once," he said. "Correct," Laura answered. The incident commander asked whether more stabilization could restore the north route. Laura looked at the frame position. "Not before we need to move people. Access is restricted beneath that landing." At 7:39, the evacuation plan lost half its capacity. The most dangerous moment of the night did not arrive with a collapse. It arrived with fewer options. Graham studied the seating geometry. The south aisle remained available, but moving every remaining student through it continuously would concentrate motion near the same lower frames. The upper center rows also could not remain occupied indefinitely, while the connection below the north landing continued to move. Adam came down 1 step from his position. "Step. Give me a sequence." Graham did not answer immediately. Laura noticed. Earlier, he would have reached for the familiar solution before the silence became uncomfortable. Now, he waited long enough to ask the question that mattered. "What are you seeing at the south frame after each group?" Laura checked the latest mark. "Stable under the current group size. I do not want more than 10 moving through the lower aisle at once." Graham nodded. "Then we do not increase group size. We reduce frequency. Clear 10, pause, let the floor settle, then take the next 10. The rescue commander asked about the students nearest the closed north side. Graham pointed upward. "They cross 1 row at a time while seated rows stay seated. No standing crowd waiting at the south aisle." Laura considered the geometry. "That can work if the coach controls the upper transfer." Adam looked at the height. "I will go up." Gerald started to object. Adam cut him off. "I told this man an hour ago that these were my bleachers. If I meant it, then I can stand on them while the kids come down." Graham looked at him for the first time since the route failure. "Do exactly what Laura calls. No improvising because a row looks nervous." Adam nodded. "Understood." At 7:44, the coach climbed the south aisle while the bleachers remained under a controlled hold. He moved slower than anyone had ever seen him move during a game. At each row, he crouched instead of asking students to stand, and told them they would move only when their section was called. The freshman beside Tessa was breathing too fast. Adam knelt near him. "What is your name?" "Evan Cole." "Evan, look at me. You are not running. You are not being left behind. You are waiting your turn." The boy nodded without looking convinced. Tessa leaned toward him. "My dad is under there with the rescue crew. If they tell us to wait, we wait." Adam heard her. Something about that trust made the first 20 minutes of the evening feel even worse. On court level, Gerald pulled the 8-year-old retrofit closeout file while crews worked. He had stopped trying to find a person to blame and started trying to understand why a system with clean inspection records had failed. "I have installation photographs," he told Laura. "If the contractor left a bolt loose or missed a weld, we may be able to isolate this faster." Laura asked him to bring the images to a table beside the court. Graham joined only after the incident commander released him from the access route. The first photograph showed the West Bank adapter plate before decking covered the frame. Gerald pointed. "Bolt orientation matches the drawing." Laura checked the next image. "Plate thickness matches." Graham looked at the weld. "Length matches the detail too." Gerald frowned. "Then maybe the crew used the wrong weld procedure." Laura enlarged another photograph showing a quality record tag. "Certified procedure, inspected at closeout." That does not prove perfection. But we cannot claim the contractor ignored the detail. They checked the East Bank. Same bolt pattern, same slot, same plate, same weld location. Gerald's frustration turned into something closer to fear. "They built it correctly." Graham looked at the approved drawing. "They built what this tells them to build." Laura heard the difference. "You recognize something?" Graham did not answer at first. In the lower corner of the detail was a notation style he had not seen in years. Not a company logo, not a designer stamp, a small field adjustment convention showing the permissible slot orientation and fit-up sequence. He had written thousands of notes in that language. "Alderline," he said. Gerald looked at him. "What is Alderline?" "Alderline Venue Constructors, my old company." Laura looked from Graham to the drawing. "Did they design this project?" "No, they were not the contractor either." "Then why is there detail here?" Graham kept staring. "Because standard details travel. An architect sees one work. A manufacturer adapts it. A consultant puts a version into another package. Years later, nobody remembers where the first field solution came from." Gerald asked the question carefully. "Did you develop it?" "No, I was never the engineer of record." Graham touched the edge of the sheet. "But I used versions of this. I supervised crews installing them. I liked them because they solved alignment problems without cutting frames apart in the field." Laura looked at the slotted connection, and if repeated movement was not fully restrained, the slot could allow microslip. Enough cycles, enough crowd loading, enough opening and closing, and the weld edge can become the place that remembers every movement. Gerald sat down. The contractor they had been preparing to blame had followed the approved documents. The inspection team had inspected the system that existed. The district had maintained a detail that had once been accepted. No villain had secretly removed a bolt. No cheap steel had been substituted. No corrupt inspector had signed a lie. The danger had survived precisely because each person could point to a document showing somebody had done what was expected. Graham looked toward the bleachers, where Tessa still waited. The story had turned again. He was no longer the janitor who knew more than the coach. He was a man facing a failure mode connected, however indirectly, to the professional culture that had once made him proud. Laura broke the silence. "This is not the time to assign historical responsibility. Does recognizing the detail change what we do tonight?" Graham appreciated the question because it pulled him out of guilt and back into usefulness. "Yes. Do not assume the plate that looks clean is unloaded. If the system has been cycling through microslip, visible damage can lag behind stiffness loss." Laura nodded. "Then we treat the remaining matching connections as suspect until inspection proves otherwise." The incident commander radioed from beneath the south side. "Ready for the next group," Laura answered. "Proceed with 10. Hold after they reach court level." The history lesson ended because children were still sitting above steel that had not finished telling them what it knew. At 7:48, another 10 students came down. At 7:49, the next group followed. Tessa's row was now close enough that Graham could see her face clearly from the court. The freshman beside her, Evan, began to panic when Adam told a different row to move first. "I cannot stay here," he said. "I need to go now." He started to stand. Tessa grabbed his sleeve and pulled him back onto the bench. "Evan, sit down. Your row is next after theirs." "I cannot do this." Adam moved toward them, but Laura had just called the next group from the far end. Graham saw the problem. Tessa was scheduled before Evan under the current row sequence. He could ask Adam to take her. Nobody would question it. Instead, Graham keyed his radio. "Laura, the freshman beside Tessa is losing control. Can his row move before hers without changing your load plan?" Laura checked the row positions. "Yes, same occupancy band. Move Evan's row first, then hold." Adam looked down toward Graham. Their eyes met across the distance. Adam understood exactly what Graham had done. He turned to Evan. "Your row is moving now. Stay behind me and keep one hand on the rail." Tessa watched the younger students stand and begin crossing toward the south aisle. She looked down at her father. Graham could not know what she was thinking, but he saw her shoulders lower. She was not angry. She understood. At 7:51, Tessa's row was called. She left the drum where it sat, crossed slowly to the south aisle, and followed Adam down. Graham stayed out at the lower frame line until she stepped onto the court. Only then did he move toward her. Tessa reached him first. "You made me wait." "I did." "Good." She wrapped both arms around him so quickly that the hard hat Laura had made him wear shifted backward. Graham held her for 3 seconds. Then he let go because 23 people were still above them. "Go with your band director. I am not done." Tessa nodded. "I know." The final rows took longer because the south route remained the only usable path. Adam stayed on the bleachers until the last student passed him. He came down behind a teacher carrying an abandoned trumpet case and stepped onto the court at 7:56. The east bank was empty. For a moment, everyone stared at it. Without people on the seats, the structure looked less dangerous than it had 10 minutes earlier. That illusion lasted until Laura went beneath the affected frame and checked the fatigue line again. She came back out holding her flashlight differently. The crack propagated. Gerald's face tightened. "How much?" "Enough that I am glad nobody stood together." Graham looked at the empty rows. No collapse came. No entire bleacher bank folded into the floor. The absence of catastrophe was the point. They had listened before the structure needed to prove the warning with bodies. At 8:02, rescue crews added stabilization to the now unloaded East Bank so inspectors could document the affected frames without relying on the temporary condition created by evacuation. The fieldhouse remained closed, the playoff game was canceled, and the district superintendent authorized a full inspection of both banks before any spectator seating could reopen. By 8:09, fire rescue confirmed the building had no remaining occupants beyond authorized staff and investigators. Parents were directed to a reunification area at the middle school. The students were released in groups. Milo Tressler left with his mother wearing a temporary brace and complaining that missing the game hurt worse than his ankle. Graham finally sat on the bottom step outside the north corridor because his legs had begun to feel the hours he had ignored. Adam came out carrying 2 bottles of water and offered him one. Graham took it. For a while, neither man spoke. The coach looked back through the glass doors at the empty gym. "I told you to stay off my bleachers." Graham unscrewed the cap. "I remember. You also told me not to fill Section C." "I remember that too." Adam nodded. "I was trying to prevent panic. That is what I told myself." Graham waited. "But I was also angry that someone I saw as a janitor was telling me what to do in a place I thought belonged to me." Graham drank before answering. "You were wrong about me." Adam looked at him. "That simple?" "No, I was wrong about the auxiliary gym. Gerald was right to remove me. Laura was right to bring me back under limits. Tonight had enough mistakes without ranking them for pride." Adam gave a tired laugh. "You are making this apology inconvenient." "Good apologies usually are." Adam looked at the bottle in his hands. "I am sorry, Graham." Graham nodded. "Accepted." That was all. The emotional payoff did not require Adam to kneel before the janitor or announce his humiliation to the school. He had already done the thing that mattered. When the route failed, he went onto the structure and stayed there until the last student came down. The rest belonged to what happened next. The district investigation began before midnight and expanded over the weekend. Laura documented the failed connections, photographed the witness marks, and requested destructive examination of selected hardware after the bleacher banks were safely dismantled. Gerald assembled the original renovation package, change orders, inspection records, maintenance logs, and closeout photographs. The evidence made one conclusion clear quickly. The contractor had not improvised the dangerous detail in the field. The adapter plates, slot orientation, weld lengths, and bolt arrangements matched the approved drawings closely enough that blaming workmanship alone would have been dishonest. Annual inspections had documented operation, guards, aisles, visible components, and general maintenance, but the fatigue mechanism had developed in a location that was not announcing itself with obvious deformation until late in the process. The district also discovered that the auxiliary gym renovation 2 years earlier had incorporated a related hardware family during accessible seating modifications. That bank was closed before use and inspected separately. No one had to invent a conspiracy to justify the danger. The more unsettling truth was procedural. A field detail had once been considered practical. Similar versions had traveled through projects and vendors because they solved alignment problems. Over time, assumptions embedded in those details became harder to see precisely because so many people had inherited them as normal. Graham spent Saturday morning at home with Tessa instead of at the school. That decision surprised him. For almost 20 years, any major project problem had pulled him toward the site with a force he considered responsibility. He had once believed that the person who understood the field best had an obligation to stay until every uncertainty was closed. This time, Laura had enough qualified people. The district had inspectors. A laboratory would examine the cracked connection. Graham made pancakes badly, drove Tessa to a rehearsal that had been moved to another school, and answered 3 calls from Laura without pretending he needed to stand beside the steel to matter. During the 3rd call, Laura told him the first metallurgical examination supported fatigue, initiating near the weld edge after repeated relative movement. "That fits what we saw," Graham said. "It does. We are not assigning design responsibility from one specimen, but we are widening the review." "Good." Laura paused. Alderline called the district. Graham stopped drying a plate. "Who?" "Their current regional director. Gerald contacted them because of the detail history. They want to compare old field standards and project archives." Graham looked through the kitchen doorway at Tessa, who was packing sheet music into a bag. "They should. They also asked whether you would participate." Graham did not answer immediately. Laura noticed. "I am not offering you a job," he smiled. "That helps. It is a technical review. Local sessions first. Maybe site visits later if the detail appears elsewhere. You can say no." Graham looked at the clock. 4 years earlier, the possibility of sitting across from people at Alderline would have felt like being dragged backward into a life he had deliberately buried. After Friday night, it felt different. The problem was not that construction had taken everything from him. The problem was that he had once allowed work to take more than he meant to give. Those were not the same thing. "Send me the schedule," he said. "I will look at it." The review over the next 2 weeks found no evidence that the entire family of details was automatically unsafe. Conditions varied by installation, restraint, cycling, fit-up, and maintenance history. What the investigation did establish was enough to change practice at Oakmere and trigger targeted inspections at other district facilities. The district adopted a stricter review process for modified telescopic seating connections, including closer attention to repeated movement, retrofit documentation, and the relationship between historical drawings and later change orders. Old inspection tags were not treated as proof that a current concern could be dismissed. They were records of what had been known at the time. Gerald requested an audit of every seating modification under his department from the previous decade. That choice cost him politically. It created work, expense, and uncomfortable questions for a district already facing budget pressure. He did it anyway. When the superintendent asked whether the audit was necessary before the engineering review finished, Gerald answered with a sentence that would have sounded impossible on Friday afternoon. "Approved paperwork tells us what people accepted. It does not replace what the structure is doing now." Adam changed too, though in a way students noticed before administrators did. At the first team meeting after the canceled playoff game, he did not tell a heroic story about himself. He told the players why the game had stopped, and why following a controlled evacuation mattered even when every instinct said to run. Then he asked Graham to speak for 5 minutes about warning signs and authority. Graham declined. Adam did not take it personally. The school already knew enough about Graham for 1 month. The janitor who built stadiums had become a hallway legend, which Graham tolerated only because most versions made Tessa roll her eyes. One student claimed he had designed professional football stadiums by himself. Another said he could hear steel cracks from 3 buildings away. Tessa corrected them when she felt like it and ignored them when she did not. The truth was less cinematic and better. Graham had spent years learning how large structures were assembled by ordinary crews following thousands of small decisions. On Friday night, that knowledge helped because he recognized a warning early. It also nearly hurt because he trusted an old drawing too quickly. What saved the night was not expertise alone. It was expertise that could be challenged. Laura challenged him. Tessa challenged him. Gerald removed him when he crossed the line. Then Laura brought him back when his field knowledge became necessary again. Adam followed a sequence he did not invent. Fire rescue placed stabilization where the engineer directed. Students stayed seated when fear told them to stand. The victory belonged to a system of people correcting one another before steel made the final decision for them. 3 weeks later, part of the West Bank had been dismantled for repair, and the East Bank remained closed, pending replacement of selected retrofit components. Yellow barriers divided the fieldhouse floor, and the school had moved games to a neighboring district. Graham arrived for his afternoon shift, carrying the same ring of custodial keys and the same aluminum mop. Nothing about his uniform had changed. That mattered to him more than he expected. He did not need the story to end with a different shirt in order for Friday night to mean something. Near the West Bank, a young maintenance employee named Peter Vaughn was sweeping debris left by an inspection crew. He saw Graham studying the exposed understructure and lifted the aluminum mop handle with a grin. "Want your inspection instrument?" Graham looked at the mop. 3 weeks earlier, that handle had been the only tool in his hand when Adam decided what kind of knowledge he was allowed to have. After the auxiliary gym mistake, Graham had left the mop against a corridor wall because even the object felt like part of a confidence he no longer trusted. Now he took it from Peter, rested it against the wall, and left it there. Not today. Laura Baines appeared from beneath the dismantled seating, with a flashlight in one hand and a folder tucked beneath her arm. "I have 2 removed frames on sawhorses. Want to look before the lab shipment leaves?" Graham checked the time. "How long?" 45 minutes if we stay focused." He checked again. Tessa's rescheduled winter concert started at 7. For a second, the old Graham measured the distance, the work, the chance that one detail could become another hour. Then he made the boundary before the work could make it for him. "I have 1 hour. Then I leave whether we are finished or not." Laura smiled. "That sounds like a man who finally learned scheduling. Do not ruin this by making it inspirational." They walked toward the inspection area. Adam was crossing the court carrying practice cones from a temporary setup. He stopped when he saw Graham approaching the open understructure. For the briefest moment, all 3 of them remembered the first sentence of Friday night. Adam looked at the bleachers, then at Graham. "Laura signed you in?" "She did." Adam nodded toward the opening. "Then I will stay out of your way." Graham almost corrected the ownership in that sentence, but he did not need to. Adam had already learned it. The bleachers were not his. The field house was not Graham's. The drawings were not Laura's truth merely because she was the engineer. Every person in the building held only a piece of responsibility, and each piece became dangerous when someone mistook it for the whole. Graham stepped beneath the dismantled frame with Laura. The cracked plate sat on a work table nearby. Without hundreds of students above it, without radios and frightened parents and a coach shouting from an aisle, it looked almost ordinary. Laura aimed the flashlight along the weld edge. "The fracture surface is clearer now." Graham leaned closer. He did not touch it. "You can see where it started." "Yes." "And where it accelerated?" Laura nodded. "Exactly." Peter, still sweeping nearby, listened despite himself. Graham noticed and waved him closer. "Come look." Peter hesitated. "I am not an engineer." Graham looked at Laura. She smiled. Neither is he. Peter came closer. Graham pointed without touching the steel. See the darker, smooth area near the edge? That is the older part. The rougher area is where the crack grew faster later. Peter leaned in. So it was warning them before Friday? Graham thought about the dull note beneath the mop handle, the witness mark, the old drawing, Tessa's memory, Laura's correction, and the students who had waited row by row instead of running. Then he answered with the line that had changed meaning every time he used it. Structures warn you before they fail, if somebody listens. Peter nodded as if he were storing the sentence for later. Graham looked at the clock once more. He had 53 minutes left. This time, that was enough. At 6:15, Graham left the field house while Laura and the inspection crew continued working. Nobody asked why he was leaving before the review finished. Nobody needed to. Tessa was waiting outside in concert black, percussion bag over one shoulder. She had come directly from rehearsal with a friend whose mother would drive them to the auditorium. She saw the flashlight clip temporarily to Graham's belt and raised an eyebrow. Consulting already? 45 minutes. That sounds suspiciously responsible. I am experimenting with limits. Tessa smiled. They walked toward the parking lot together. Behind them, the field house doors closed on a building that was still being repaired, still being questioned, and now being listened to differently. Graham had not returned to the life he left. He had returned only to the part of himself he no longer needed to abandon. And this time, when the work asked for more than he meant to give, he knew how to leave.